Perfect. Thank you so much. So let's go on. We would like me, Owen, and Omri to present you with something that we did last year in Germany. It was an experiment. At least for ECAS, this was something completely new. We are very, very happy with this experience. We learned a lot from it. Some of the aspects and our expectations basically came to full fruition and we saw the results. Some others, we got a bit disappointed, but nevertheless, it was a very valuable learning process. So what we did was that we carried out a campaign in Germany immediately after the elections last year, with the intention to try and to influence the opinion of the so-called movable middle audiences. And Owen will be so kind to present more details about which those audiences are. I just want to say why we decided to do that at first place and why did we pick Germany at second place. So one of the reasons why we decided to do it is because we have figured out that at European level, in each and every member state, basically, not only in Germany, there is this really movable middle audiences, which is different from the cosmopolitans, the people like us who support freedom of movement unconditionally. It's also different from the extreme conservatives, which basically are a similar percentage to the cosmopolitans where you can't do much because they're just very firmly rooted in their beliefs. But there are those audiences in the middle who in principle are not against freedom of movement in the EU, but somehow support it conditionally or selectively. For example, they support freedom of movement, but of high-skilled workers. They do not support freedom of movement of others. Or they support freedom of movement, but again, based on cultural preferences. So we wanted to see if we can basically implement a campaign where we can influence their opinion, mainly based on connecting with their values and emotions. And again, this is something that we have done for the first time at ECAS, and we were very, very grateful also for the fact that Alliance for Europe joined us, and for ICPA, who are our so-called guardians, methodological guardians, but also guardians in terms of knowledge, skills, and technical support all the time. And we have chosen Germany because Germany, of course, is a very important player in the decision-making process at EU level, also because we see now that Germany is the country hosting the highest number of EU mobile citizens on their territory, and we also see that EU mobile citizens are experiencing difficulties there. So now I would really appreciate if Owen gives a bit more information about how we translated and identified those audiences in Germany specifically, the ones that we have been seeing and profiling at European level, and also eventually some of the results that we achieved versus the objectives, and of course, Owen, everything that is important for you in terms of lessons learned as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Assya. Yeah, I'm really happy to share for ICPA as well. This was a new adventure to try and take on a European coalition. We had worked in Germany actually, and worked quite a lot in Kazakhstan actually on civic space issues as well. So but anyway, yeah, let me just get on with this. I'll share my screen here. Okay. Just start here. Okay, as Assya said here, I think it's important for us to realize a little bit, yeah, this was the alliance that came together here, and I thought that I could start with the top line. And if you even just get one thing from this presentation, there it is, that actually value-based messaging mobility works with the middle. And I think that that's a, you know, this, Assya said it exactly right. This was an experiment, actually, right? And I think we were trying to see, actually, could we make a connection to the so-called movable middle audiences and move them in a more positive direction on these attitudes. I think this links quite nicely actually to what Caroline just said in terms of the street level bureaucrats, because ultimately as well, the chances are many of them are also in these middle segments actually. Okay, so what are the basics here in terms of this kind of narrative changed or value-based messaging approach? The basics are that actually oftentimes we get stuck in the progressive side, negating kind of anti-migrant or anti-diversity frames. And in fact, ultimately, one of the things that happens is that we really, really need to not just, it's important for us to negate these things, but it's not, necessary but not sufficient. And most of the time, what we really need to do is think about, how can we change the weather, actually? How can we have the conversations we want to have and not just get stuck in the negativity that comes mostly from the right and the far right? A value-based messaging approach, just to put it really simply here, means that what we're really trying to do is target more warm, positive responses. And maybe the best way to put this is that what we really kind of need here is we need much more of an understanding that we need a kind of more emotionally smart way to get people to the table so we can talk about these issues, not push them away actually, much of the time. So it doesn't mean that I think you've heard it when you've heard about narrative change, you hear that, facts don't work kind of thing, but that's not the case. It's when we bring the evidence in. So, and that's the issue that we have seen here. So overall, then you can see we're really targeting more positive responses. We're trying to build bridges through shared values and experiences, but then challenge actually, we are trying to reduce anxiety, increase existing support for mobility, and hopefully in this issue here, get more positive coverage and support from valued messengers. And ultimately, this is the logic then make more political space for progressive choices and implementation. Okay, this is definitely the whistle-stop tour through this, but I'm happy to answer questions on this too. So how did we start? In ICPA, actually, as we were the methodological guardians, we're also the ones that kind of dealt a lot with the research and evaluation side of this project here. We started in 2020 with the support of EPIM, actually trying to pull together and understand the broad range of European attitudes to mobility, drawing on Eurobarometer and ESS data. And this was the first set of segmented attitudes we worked with. For this project, of course, we were looking for Germany. So what we tried to do was find an overlap between those European segments and a more recent study by More in Common. And what we ended up actually choosing on our target audiences in this particular project were what are called the established and the detached. They're actually really quite different audiences, actually. I would say the established are the ones that are very plugged in, associated, the ones who are very much part of their communities and proud to be part of their communities. And yet, they do have some skepticism on these issues, all right? So they're the easier ones. As we can see, and we'll see in the results as well, the detached are, younger, actually, and really not that engaged as the name would say here, and they were much more of a challenge for us to bring on board. Okay, so what did we do? We looked at that research. We really dug into it. In 2020, we started off. We were looking at the COVID-19 situation and thinking that maybe people would, think that the freedom or release moment would be a moment of joy. But of course, that was yet to come, actually. There was a long time off. So this was our initial thought, that ultimately, if we could find messages of interdependence and togetherness, of community, of thinking about participation and bonding, actually, that in fact we could open something there. A through line, I think, was a really important part of the work that we did here, was trying to show that movement is key or intrinsic to our whole ecosystem. And that was something that we really tried to build into the messaging as we went through here. So the essence of the pilot was this. We actually took those more broader values and actually we tried to translate them then into a German situation and finding what we called a unifying value appeal around these issues of community bonds and work ethic, even safety, stability, and personal pride. We ended up actually building stories around individual protagonists, and we connected it actually, as Assya said, around the coalition negotiations. This was our moment. We actually thought the COVID thing because it was moving backwards and forwards. It was a bit risky for us actually as a binding moment. And the whole notion then at the end was to directly appeal to these middle audiences and hopefully appeal to influencers and try to earn, you know, who would then convince them even more to see if that attitude would shift. Okay. Before we actually went out to the public, one of the things that we did was one of the things that's very important in this work is to test. And we actually did in May last year with the target segments, our first draft of the pitch, and the stories were tested online. Actually, unfortunately, because of the COVID situation, we couldn't do face-to-face focus groups, and this really helped us in terms of understanding what would actually work with these particular audiences, and it guided us in taking it forward. We ended up with 3 stories based on our values, one around a baker, one around a sort of community response to an EU mobile citizen having troubles in a bakery. The second was about a kind of aspirational girl becoming an engineer, and the third was a kind of that inter-country love story. This was our approach. In the pilots, in terms of the specifics here, our idea was that we would target 3 city regions or suburbs that where we could find our segments and that were a kind of good variety of attitudes across the German spectrum. So we had Berlin and Brandenburg, Cologne and the Ruhr, Munich and suburbs, and then, as we said, the coalition building period was our rollout time. In terms of evaluation, then, when we're talking about narrative change work, in ICPA we came up with this evaluation approach where we're trying to measure 1, reach, response and uptake. In terms of reach, what you're literally asking is, you know, how many people saw the material and how many people from your segment saw it, actually, you know, and were you able to actually, you know, put it in their feeds more or less. This can also, it's not just a social media thing, it could also be a media element of this. The second then is, where did you get the kind of warm responses and not trigger a huge amount of negativity in this regard here? And the last question of uptake is, are the valued messengers and influencers or political people starting to use the narrative, starting to, take on the narrative work and the stories that you put out there, you know? So ultimately, in terms of the target, when it comes to this work, what you're trying to do is build presence. So, you know, so that you have kind of the narratives you put out begin to spread throughout the community a little bit. And ultimately, you're trying to measure here what kind of footprint you had in the public discourse around these issues. As this was a pilot, actually, our targets were more limited, actually, because we had a kind of limited amount of funding, time. The focus here was much more, could we have more good reach numbers in the 3 target cities? Would we get warm responses in social media, not too much negative backlash? Would the messaging and content move target audiences in a positive direction? And would we get positive coverage online and earn content from media and bloggers? Well, our focus, so you can see here, was much more on reach and response. We didn't think, given the situation we were in and the funding we had and the time we had, that actually we could move beyond response in this actual pilot here. Okay, so I'm not going to talk too much about the detail of this, but in terms of the reach, we had good reach numbers, reaching around 19% of our audience, and actually did it relatively cheaply. Omri, I know, is going to talk more about this, so I'll leave that here, just to show here. In terms of response, our bigger success was through shifting attitudes, actually. So we used a service called Swayable, where 2 of the pieces of material, basically what we did was, this is a company that runs these so-called like randomized controlled tests, where half the group basically sees some of the videos and answers questions, one of the campaign videos, and the other half sees something different, like some other video that's not related. So we ran one of these randomized controlled tests. The questions we were asking were, as I mentioned, could we increase favorability around the EU in general and also on mobility in general? But those issues that keep coming up that are the more challenging in terms of public attitudes around, you know, low-skilled workers and people coming from poorer countries, even homeless, very poor people, We asked questions even about should EU mobile citizens have same access to rights and support, and the famous competition frame. You know, that basically mobile citizens or migrants basically take away from our public services here. The good news was actually this kind of messaging really worked to move movable middle audiences by 3% on even favorability and 3% on average, I would say, in this regard. In relation to other material tested on its platform, this was in about the 60th to 70th percentile. So this is a good result, actually, in this regard here. One thing that's really important to note here is actually for older conservatives, CDU supporters, it actually worked even more, so up to about 6 to 7%, which is a really, really good result. Okay, I'm coming to the end here. Sorry about the quickness of all of this. Hopefully there's lots of questions that you would have here. We did actually get a very low-level organic response or engagement to online. I think Omri might talk about this a little bit more. We had a low-level response from influencers in the media, politicians. Facebook Ad Manager created quite a lot of obstacles for us in terms of spending. So we ended up doing a lot of this work on YouTube through YouTube ads. The coalition talks themselves created a wait and see attitude. So people weren't really jumping on board, even though we reached out a lot to political leaders around this time. For me, this time, for the first time, migration mobility was not high on the agenda, actually, in the political talks in Germany at this time. And maybe this created an obstacle for us. So in terms of takeaways then, for me, that's the key message. Value-based messaging and stories to the middle actually work. And maybe we needed a lot more social capital or connection to the middle in the coalition that maybe would have allowed us to access the influencers a little bit more. But this was a pilot. We were trying to see if this was much more of a way to go, in terms of approach. Yeah, maybe we could actually have worked a lot more on trying to sort of coordinate a little bit the agenda setting or the policy work with the narrative work. And maybe that's a lesson for the future. And last but not least, and I'll finish here. Yeah, this work requires a larger investment in terms of infrastructure. If we really want to create presence, surround sound, volume, and velocity, then in fact, we would actually really need a lot more funding and a lot more partnership, a lot more spreading and a lot more constancy going forward. Sorry for the quickness of that. I tried to just hit the top lines. So yeah, happy to take questions and we're happy to hand over to Omri.
Thanks a lot.
And the truth is that now we are much more prepared, but also we would have normally needed much more time for preparatory work in order to be able also to set up the context. So we also had we had some limitations in terms of timing as well, right?
Indeed, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes. Shall I jump in, or is there anything more in the middle, in between us? No. Okay, then I'll come in, and I think Eoin has now shown us quite a lot of data. I'm gonna have to try and contain myself from just telling you how much I agree with some of the important points that he made there about our experience, and just to give you an idea of how the campaign actually rolled out. Once we had done the basic discussion where we compiled the research, understood what are the values that we're trying to highlight, we then went through a creative process and a strategic process where we defined the kind of stories that we wanted to tell. So we landed on telling a story about two people falling in love, a bakery, and a race driver that is a car mechanic, to kind of show migrants, so-called migrants or mobile citizens, in a new light, in a way that maybe they're not usually presented, because usually, as Eoin was mentioning, progressives, cosmopolitans present these people as people we should sympathize with, that we should show some kind of solidarity with, or they are presented by the hard right, the far right, as just a problem. And so this is a different way to show them. And so we worked with a filmmaker to set up these 3 videos. And at the same time, we set up some visuals, just some static sort of meme style visuals that we were putting out on Facebook. And so what we saw, first of all, is, you know, the most important takeaway from this, I think, if you need to remember anything from it, is testing, 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 testing. You are never your own target audience. As a campaigner, you're always subjective. You always have your baby and your passion about the issue, your expertise, etc. You really need to check what actually connects with your audience. So, you know, once we started putting out some of these visuals on Facebook that showed, some of them also showed some more empathetic pictures, you know, things that were slightly sliding towards the cosmopolitan side of things. We immediately got a lot of angry comments, you know, that were showing that this was going in a different direction. So whoop, we had to course correct. Then, you know, once these videos started going, we actually saw that they were performing differently from what we expected. So all of us thought, well, you know, in this demographic that we're targeting, this car story, this story about a person driving a fast car around the track, should probably perform well because it looked really cool. It was, you know, it was eye-catching and so on. And I personally thought, well, this is probably going to be the best performing content. Turns out I was wrong. Turns out this video about a bakery actually performed best. And the love story, which we also had the hopes for, performed the worst. So you always need to test and you always need to course correct as you go, to really make sure that you stay on track. And this is something that I think is a no-brainer in sort of corporate marketing, but is something that sometimes in these kinds of campaigns can sort of be left behind. Then, I mean, as you saw on the graphs there that Eoin showed, we did reach between 17% and 22% of our target audience in those cities, which is a large number. I mean, in previous campaigns that Alliance for Europe and ICPA that we ran, you know, as a reference point, we had reached about 8%, let's say, or 6% of the target audience. So just to let you know that this is quite a lot. We also had quite a well-defined target audience. At the start of the process, we had also commissioned a demographic study that really did a breakdown of where exactly our demographic lived, and also a very detailed breakdown of what kind of appeal they had, you know, in terms of the type of marketing segments, their economic condition, these sorts of things, so that when it came to actually targeting the ads, it was much more effective. And this is not targeted advertising in the sense that, you know, like we know that you click this link, so we're going to send you this thing, but it's broader demographic targeting. And then what we saw is that our return on investment was very, very good. So we had 60 cents per click on our YouTube advertising versus a regular amount for reference, which would be twice as high, 1.2 euros. So that was very good. On the other hand, we saw that we really didn't have as much engagement as we would have liked, you know, especially on Facebook. We didn't have as many comments as we would like to have, and we were trying to course correct for this as we went, but this remained a challenge. And I guess, you know, that this audience is called disengaged for a reason. They are just harder to engage. We need to accept that, and we need to keep on creatively finding ways of engaging them. And so maybe just to wrap up here, resonating with what Eoin said about the key learnings about the media landscape and the political agenda, it's also much harder to present a campaign like this as headline news if people aren't seeing it in the media, if we're not giving them a fancy headline. And so we saw that in order to meaningfully engage influencers, because they didn't have that sort of media attraction reference point, we would have needed to pay for influencer engagement, and that we didn't have the budget for. So at a next opportunity, we would need to do that, maybe have paid influencer outreach or the media headline, in order to perhaps then drive up engagement in a new way. And of course, narrative shift takes some time to take hold. So by definition, we would need a longer time frame for all of these pieces to come into place, engaging the politicians, getting the reach, driving the conversation, connecting it with advocacy goals, achieving those advocacy goals. All of that stuff takes time. And, in a 2-month campaign, there's only so much we can actually do. So overall, yeah, it was a great fun experience, doing all of this stuff and being able to sort of fly the plane as we do it. And it was a real pleasure to work with you guys. So thank you.
Thank you, Omri. Thank you very much. I can subscribe to all the conclusions here. I think for me, the most difficult part was really to put myself in the shoes of the target group. Just because here it's not only like a mere description of the target group, but you are trying to second guess really their values and the emotions that you will trigger with the content. This has been very, very difficult. And I think this is one of the reasons why somehow we didn't pay enough attention to basically engaging maybe politicians or multiplier, just because, at least from where we stand, we knew that this is a part which somehow we know how to do. Unlike the other part, which is really to campaign towards an audience who have no idea who they are. So somehow we were so much focused on trying to make everything possible to make this work, that we neglected a bit the other part, which, as we saw, shouldn't be taken for granted. But this was a great adventure, and yeah, I mean, I'm really looking forward to repeating and upscaling it somehow. So now, because basically I don't see any questions in the chat, nevertheless, I will ask the participants just to raise their hands if they want to make any comments on this specific subject and what we presented, or on any other of the previous subjects that we touched upon. So I'm checking if someone would like to take the floor and make a comment.
I raised my hand.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you. I found the pilot extremely interesting. I didn't know about the technique, and I have 2 small questions. The first one is the following. Since I think that the European Union at least implicitly should be part of your value set, did you consider inserting here and there any cues about the European Union and maybe the role that it plays in facilitating free movement and providing services to free movers, but also really also to stayers, because the EU also provides funds for a lot of local initiatives, and people just don't know, are not aware of them. I will say this later in my presentation. And the second question is, to what extent is this technique of value messaging really already, used, not as in a sophisticated way like the one that you adopted, but by institutions of the European Union or pro-European political parties and actors? Because given the success that you seem to have achieved, I think it would be a very valuable technique, for campaigning beyond, on a larger scale, as Assya suggested. Thank you.
Oh, beyond usual suspects that we usually engage because they think like us, no? I can just say one thing. I know that this technique is used by political players. Whether they're pro-European political players that they use it, I doubt. But I'm sure Omri, who has much more experience with campaigning than me, could provide some more insights, and also Eoin. So Omri, what is your response to that?
So yeah, I think that our weakness in a way as progressives or as cosmopolitans is that we feel very strongly about this set of values that we hold, and we just want people to agree with us. We sort of have this intuitive feeling like, I've checked the facts, and I'm going to be able to persuade you with the things that I'm saying, and why don't we have a democratic debate and so on. So if you've read the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, then you'll know that he refers to this thinking system of fast thinking and slow thinking. And slow thinking is the rational sort of deliberation. Fast thinking is intuition. And we need to be aware, if we want to run a democracy and we want to have real, meaningful democratic debate, that we're not just robots, we're not just rational actors. We have emotions and intuitions. And as counterintuitive as it feels to progressives to really engage in this kind of emotional messaging, it's something that we need to do as part of our democratic discourse. Now, on the far right, because they are much more, cynical about their approaches, like there's no regard for facts and fact checking and things like that. In fact, disinformation is used intentionally as a tactic. Then there's much more of an attitude of like, let's get all the data, let's check what's going on, and let's just do the thing that works best. Like, I don't really care what my message is as long as it works with, the people that I'm trying to influence, not debate with or engage, but influence. So I think that since the Obama campaign in 2008, there has been a gradual move, usually with every American election cycle, of moving progressives and pro-democratic organizations closer and closer and further in these more sort of scientific or social scientific approaches and data-driven approaches to campaigning. And especially with Brexit and Trump, there has been a real push towards this. In reality, doing this kinds of stuff costs a lot more money, so that a lot of civil society organizations just don't really have the budget to invest in this kind of thing. Whereas if you're a far-right organization that gets money from Russian oligarchs or the Russian government, then you will much more likely have the budget for this. So I think this is something that funders also need to take into account. So on the one hand, I think there are lots and lots of campaigns that do not take any of this into account, but gradually over the last couple of years, since 2016 and then another push since 2020, there are more and more organizations that are doing this. And this is also part of why we set up Alliance for Europe in 2018, 2019, especially to be able to infuse these kinds of campaign tactics and strategies into what we do. And I see that.
What about the EU? I mean, the EU should be extremely interested in mobilizing, potential supporters, what I call the silent majority, because we know that the anti-EU, the far right, or let's say the Eurosceptics, are not more than 30%. And that's the maximum in certain countries. So and we know from surveys that the other 70% are silent pro-EU majorities. They are in favor of solidarity. They are in favor of free movement. They are just not mobilized. And so the EU should have all, the political interest, but also the normative interest in engaging in such mobilization. And they have the money.
Eoin, do you want to respond?
Yes, and maybe just if I can ask Eoin to comment a bit on this question from Julie about the 3% change. Against what measure? Is it good? Is it bad? As for the campaign, I wouldn't necessarily say that running the campaign itself towards the audience should be longer, but the preparatory work should be longer. The one that involves multipliers and also politicians. If we want, once we carry out the campaign, it to really land up in a context which is prepared to somehow maximize the results. But I'm sure Eoin, as a specialist, has more to say on this subject. So, Eoin?
sound?
Maurizio, just to take your point at the start, did we, try to bring around the institutional kind of line here? When I talked about that idea of values, stories, and issues kind of thing here, actually most people, frankly, are not that interested in the institutions. So what you're trying to do with this approach is to start from, connecting with people in a way, shared experiences, values, aspirations, and challenges, right? And then what we actually did the whole time, our protagonists were all EU mobile citizens. That was the whole point. So we were kind of reversing backwards, right? So make them try to build some sort of support. But like I said here, if you can connect a little more, then it does open a door, and it can open a door to talking about, understanding mobility, if you will, right? So I would suggest it's the sequencing that's important here, not the fact that you can't talk about it, but where to start. And I think this links quite a lot actually to your question about the EU. In fact, I think that the EU itself often, I think, tries to explain institutionally itself to the public, and it's not that, frankly, not that engaging. But slowly but surely, I think a person shared already. There's, for example, we've worked quite closely with OHCHR, the human rights organization. The UN has taken this on. So I think there's a lot more people who begin, who are thinking a lot more about, as exactly like you said, that actually we need a more complicated view of the public, and actually this notion of the movable middle is very important to understand. They're not that involved, not that engaged. It's not there every day. So for example, a lot of the discrimination is invisible to them, right? So if you talk about race and racism and discrimination to them, they're like, well, that's nothing to do with me, So you really have to kind of move them in a certain direction. So I think slowly but surely this is coming to fruition in terms of that from the progressive side, we need to be a lot more emotionally smart in how we bring people on board and build the kind of political support and tip the balance. And on those two specific questions for me, what type of influencers? The question of how long a campaign like this should run, and is 3% a good measure? I can kind of put those things together. So what we're trying to do oftentimes is you're trying to understand whether the content you put out there is actually, something that reduces anxiety. Think about how polarizing these issues are. So even by reducing anxiety, you begin to bring people to the table. So 3 to 4%, 3% is at what measure? It's actually, this is a company, Swayable, that we worked with. They work a lot with people like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, and actually on their platform, for them, they said that 3-4% on all of the video material that they have tested is in about the 60th to 70th percentile. So it's an average result, all right, is what I would say. Good, average to good result in terms of movement. For us in this work here, we were thinking, can this work? Actually, can we produce material that allows for this movement? And I think that was the big result for us in this regard. How long, I think, how long such a campaign run for? I think we need to think a lot more about, so I think in this case here, we need to move away from the notion of just single campaigns. So from moment to movement here a little bit. For me, like what we've proven here is this is a narrative change strategy. So you could actually, if this could be done at a much larger scale and not only thought of as, needing expensive campaigning as the rubric to roll out, but a narrative strategy that could be shared with a broad range of stakeholders, that could be shared through many different ways. So for example, I would suggest to Assya, she is putting together her training projects for on EU mobility. I would suggest to her that thinking about how to introduce the notion of mobility and actually using the values, the narratives that we've produced, thinking about the audience is in fact, so it's trying, that would be a useful thing to do. So not only thinking about campaigns, but actually what a lot of people are talking about at this point is strategic communication. And that does not just mean doing communication well. It's about how can we target shifts of norms, of attitudes at the broader scale, actually, And us in ICPA, we're trying to think a lot more about a kind of more movement-based response, because actually, in a sense here, we really are talking about how core norms could possibly shift in this regard, and that's what's actually needed. So it really is, it's a much more bigger picture ask, Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Owen. I will come back to you on the question of how we can incorporate lessons learned in our training modules. That's a very good point. I haven't thought about that. Now you gave me an idea. But before moving forward, basically, I would like also to give the floor to Simona because I see that she has raised her hand. And apology if I have missed you previously, Simona.
No worries. Thank you, Assya. I just had a quick question to Owen as well, because when we were working together on the campaign, I know many times we spent a lot of time discussing on the messages that should be conveyed and how to more appropriately address the target groups. And then there were discussions around the issue of homelessness among mobile EU citizens. And I saw you mentioned at some point in your slide that you had some questions about this. I was just curious if you have more information to share on people's reaction to that. Thank you.
Oh, in just one sentence, please, and then we can send the report, right? I mean, the detailed report also to Simona.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Simona, we were first of all, nice to see you again, and secondly, yeah, we were very cognizant of in this test to actually keep on board, you know, the things that we had seen at the very start, you know. Just for everybody, you know, more broadly in public attitudes, EU mobility is broadly supported. But once you begin to talk about poorer countries, low-skilled workers, people who are, you know, homeless, for example, then the support tends to go down. So we directly asked the question, Simona, in the Swayable test on people. So I'm really happy to share with you the detailed data on, and basically what we did in that test was show how the messaging input shifted attitudes in that regard here. So I could actually break that out for you and give you kind of more access to that data, no problem. So yeah, but it worked.
Perfect, and maybe let's follow it up with a joint meeting, like a more limited meeting where we can go, because we need to reflect more in depth on what we have basically learned also really among ourselves. So it will be a good idea to follow this up.